Talking to Cornelius. Conversation 23. In the month of December last, I was induced to proceed to Mount Alexander to purchase gold, and I engaged a party of emigrants from the Hooghly to go with me and dig. During the month of January, up to last Saturday, I have been with them. I can therefore assert that from my experience of the state of matters there, unless vigorous measures are resorted to without delay, the result will be disastrous. Upon that portion of the Forest Creek where my tent was pitched, fronting what is termed the Golden Gully, upon a line nearly with Mr. Steele's store, I found much uproar and great insecurity. I shall mention one instance. One evening, soon after the new year had been ushered in by the most disgusting bacchanalian orgies, I had gone to bed and was fast asleep when I was awakened by Mr. Thomas Tate, who had charge of the digging party and of the tent in my absence, and who awoke me, remarking something was wrong. We could distinctly hear some signals being given, and we dressed ourselves without delay. Upon emerging from the tent, Mr. Tate could distinctly see a large party gathering, and although my eyesight has been very much impaired by a service of about 9 years as editor of a public journal, I was sensible of a crowd gathering a short distance from me. In less time than I have occupied in relating this circumstance, the tent of a party of sailors, who had been, it was supposed, very successful in the Golden Gully, was attacked by force of arms, the picks and shovels were broken, and the gold abstracted. We resolved that we would not quit our tent, and I commenced loading my gun and preparing to defend my property. We were not disturbed, for the marauders took another direction. The Argus, Melbourne, 30th of January, 1852. Danger accompanied the joy of a lucky strike. One man's good fortune could be seen as an injustice to a long-labouring neighbour. Agreements could suddenly appear questionable, friendships could collapse in mistrust, and in all that social brew of luck and misfortune, greed inevitably gave birth to violence and intimidation. This was no easy place to be, old man, and I'd love to know how you negotiated your way through it all. The criminal anarchy of a place like Forest Creek was too much for honest diggers. There they were, paying their licence fees, and surely that entitled them to the guarantee of government-enforced law and order, but there was close to nothing of that nature from the government. Diggers were taxed, but they weren't served by the government. The general dissatisfaction soon progressed towards an organised response. If the government didn't enforce law and order in the goldfields, then the diggers would take the law into their own hands. If the government wasn't prepared to use a portion of the licence fees to finance an effective police presence on the fields, then the diggers would keep the fee money and finance their own local police force. If the government didn't bring a judicial process to bear on the injustices that were a daily occurrence, then the diggers would carry out justice by their own reckoning. Defiance to the government. There is an incipient rebellion at Mount Alexander, for the gold diggers have held meetings and passed resolutions declaratory of their determination to take the administration of the law into their own hands. The meetings took place at Long Flat on the 29th of September and on the 2nd of October at Lever Point, when it was resolved to form a Diggers Mutual Protection Association. It was resolved that unless the government promptly interfere, the association shall have a depot prison to secure offenders who are to be summarily dealt with, and moreover that the licence fee hitherto paid to the government shall go to organise a well-armed patrol. It may be that the resolutions are more energetic than will be the consequent action, but the menace should not be disregarded, for with unprincipled leaders, the unsettled population on the goldfields might, especially in the case of partial failure of the good fortune which has hitherto been enjoyed, become exceedingly dangerous. Geelong Advertiser and Intelligencer, 7th of October, 1852. It's fascinating to observe this great bubbling cauldron of social forces that were at play in 1852 Victoria. There was the fire of the Jack is as good as his master egalitarian instinct, the residual bitterness and mistrust of ex-convicts who had borne the disempowering grind of government control in their lives. There was the anarchic free-for-all of bushrangers who experienced the boundless country as a space where they could get away with anything they liked. There was the explosive good fortune and greedy tension of the goldfields, the potent grip of new political ideas among workers, the vigorous cultural melting pot of an ever-expanding Melbourne, the immigrant challenge of adaptation to a new world, and there were the first people who experienced all of this as an often violent and ever-increasing invasion and dispossession of their land. The idea of colonists organising themselves and essentially claiming the right to self-government on the goldfields must have triggered warning signals in a British governing mind. It was reminiscent of that ultimate failure in colonial management, otherwise known as the United States of America. The local agitation was made all the more reminiscent of the United States when diggers started throwing around the old American line that there should be no taxation without representation. The American Revolution was not a far-distant historical event in 1852. It had only come to an end 69 years before. David Collins, the first Lieutenant Governor in southern Van Diemen's Land, was one of the Redcoats in Boston who were forced to evacuate from the besieged city in the earliest days of the Revolution. That was the beginning and end of his involvement in the war. He was not on board that formidable armada that filled New York Harbour some months later at the start of the long campaign. Charlie Joe Latrobe, first Lieutenant Governor of Victoria, didn't have the baggage of an American war veteran. He was born well after the war in 1801. His mother was in fact born in America, and he travelled through the United States and Mexico in his earlier years. He wrote 2 books about his adventures. His style shows him as a keen observer of the natural world and the ways of societies beyond the boundaries of the empire. He was fascinated by the new nation's experiment with democracy, though he presumed it left the country vulnerable to the future rule of a despot, and that it was easily thrown about by the fashions of the moment. What will retard the growth of real talent in America more than anything, and prevent its soaring in many instances above mediocrity, smothering it in the bud, will be false praise, false standards of excellence, and a compliance with the vitiated taste and models of the age. There exists not a young aspirant to talent of whatever description who cannot find a coterie both willing and ready to praise and flatter, and where this poison is administered to a young mind, removed from the opportunities of making comparison between his own works and those of real and mature excellence, its bad effect is commonly irretrievably destructive of future and justly merited distinction. It will be a misfortune for America, whatever she may think, if she encourages a disposition in her sons to look no further than themselves for their standard of excellence in literature and in the arts, as well as in politics. Charles La Trobe, The Rambler in North America, 1835. There was so much going on in Victoria. I wonder if you felt some kind of boil-over was imminent, old man. I've never established if your brother James made his way across Bass Strait to join you at the diggings. I've tended to believe he remained down in the Franklin area in Van Diemen's Land, but I have no clear evidence to support that belief. I do know that people were corresponding with you. The Argus regularly published lists of people who had unclaimed letters at the Melbourne General Post Office. Your name appeared in the list on the 21st of June, 1852. I imagine James writing to you about the state of affairs in the Huon region, how the magistrate Tomlins had fallen from grace, lost his position, and left the area, which crops were growing well and which poorly, who was doing what to whom in the local community, how much bushwork was available on account of the growing demand for timber. That world of small plot farms scattered over hills, all surrounding forests, and the clear flowing Huon River must have been a striking mental contrast to the intense world that was all around you in Victoria. It wasn't unusual for people to go back to the island colony after they'd chanced their fortune in the gold rush. Those who returned had their reasons. The Jeeves brothers returned to Lightwood Bottom, where they had established a timber camp before heading to Victoria. Blackwood grew there, and there was plenty more timber up through the hills. It was a good place for them to call home and marry and multiply. Before long there was enough family to constitute a town and an appropriate name change. Your decision to return is something I want to know more about. Actually, no isn't quite the right word. I want to find my way to where you were, old man, when your mind took flight to Van Diemen's Land, and when you started considering the return, maybe through snatches of a memory, or from the lines of a letter, or the lingering traces of a dream. I want to feel the movement of your thoughts through all that was bright and dark about your history on the island, and how the light prevailed in the end. And how did that light prevail? Was it through the call of family, the consolation of a familiar country, or did you see something in the way Melbourne was developing that reminded you of the combustible intensity of Belfast? And where was your voice in all of this, Momar? Were your experiences of the clearances in Ireland and the vulnerability of not owning a home and land part of the reasoning? Did you glean something in what was said about the island colony that gave you a greater measure of hope for the future? Did you look around at Gold Rush Victoria, old man, and know that it was a good place for a young man's adventures, a place whose stories you could keep ladling out well into your old age? But it was not such a good place for raising a family. Maybe it was all of the above. Maybe none. The simple, recorded fact is that you and Bridget left Melbourne for Hobart on a ship called the Workington in June of 1853.